begin the tubular bind off in the round, I am going to place a removable stitch marker on the first 2 stitches so I can actually work off of this stitch marker towards the end, and this will just help me kind of keep the stitches in place. And I'm going to remove this stitch marker because I basically know the beginning and end of the round. Now I'm going to measure 3 times the length of the work that I am going to bind off as a reference, and that's about the length of the yarn that I will need. So I'm just estimating here based on this length, and this should be way more than you need, but the last thing you want is to be short. So I just measured about 3 times the length, and I think one of the hardest things about the tubular bind off is the length of this yarn when you are binding off such a large piece of work. This doesn't come into play as much when you're knitting sleeves. And when the yarn is longer and when the yarn is doubled, when you're holding 2 strands together, it can get easily tangled. So I am just going to show you what I do to keep the work, to make sure the work doesn't get tangled. So I'm going to thread my tapestry needle right now. And I'm going to pull through so that I have a pretty long tail, and that'll just help to kind of shorten the overall length of the yarn I'm working with. And the best thing to do to not get it tangled is to kind of keep it over to the side. Okay, so to begin, I'm going to just pull this through so stitches don't slip off. The first thing to note is that I'm going to show you how to work the tubular bind off in 2 steps, because I think it's easier to remember and easier to kind of envision and understand when you're just completing 2 steps. And we're working with 1x1 rib. So the first stitch is a knit stitch, and then we have a purl stitch. So you're going to basically do 1 step for the knit stitches and 1 step for the purl stitches. And we're at the beginning of the round, but it is still essentially the same. So I have my stitch marker on the removable stitch marker through these first 2 stitches, so that when I come back around, I can work these stitches again, and that'll just kind of seam up the tubular bind off in the round. Okay, so let's get started with our first stitch. Our first stitch is a knit stitch. So our first step is to slip the first knit stitch off knitwise, skip the purl stitch, and go into the second stitch on the needle purlwise and pull the yarn through. That's it. That is the first step. And then when you start to pull through, keep this yarn off to the side, and it can get a little tangled with the removable stitch marker at the beginning, but just do your best to work slowly and pull that through neatly. And you're gonna wanna make sure you pull everything pretty tight. Our next stitch is a purl stitch. So we're going to take our needle purlwise and slip that first stitch off, skip the next stitch, and then we're gonna come in from the back in between those stitches, and then we're gonna go in knitwise into that second stitch. So that's the trickier of the 2, and again, as you start to pull through, just make sure you have this work to the side, make sure it's not getting caught on the removable stitch marker. Pull through carefully. You can kind of straighten the yarn out as it gets tighter, and make sure, again, it doesn't get caught on that removable stitch marker. And when you're working with a strand of mohair too, it can be a little trickier. Okay, and I pulled that pretty tight. So now we're off of those 2 stitches from the removable stitch marker. Now it might be a little easier to see. I'm gonna just zoom in here a little bit now so you can see this. I'm on a knit stitch. I'm gonna slip the stitch off knitwise, skip the next stitch, enter the second stitch on the left-hand needle purlwise, pull that through. Second step, slip the purl stitch off purlwise, skip the next stitch, push the needle from back to front in between the first and second stitch that are now on the needle, come around and enter knitwise and pull the yarn through. Pull it pretty tight, slip the first stitch off knitwise, skip the next stitch, enter purlwise on the second stitch, pull through, run a purl stitch, slip the first stitch off purlwise, push the needle from back to front, come around and enter knitwise through that second stitch on the left-hand needle. Pull through. I'm just going to continue slipping a stitch off knitwise, skipping a stitch, pushing the needle through purlwise on the second stitch on the needle, pull through, slip the stitch off purlwise, come around, pull through. Again, just being careful to not get the work twisted. So that's what it starts to look like. I'll show you one more time. Slip the knit stitch off knitwise, skip the next stitch, the first stitch that's now on the needle, enter that second stitch purlwise and pull through. Slip the first stitch off purlwise, come from back to front in between the next two stitches, come around and enter that second stitch knitwise and pull through. So I will show you what to do when you are finishing up binding off and how to connect the work. I'm just finishing up the round here. I have a few more stitches left, so I'll just show you how I am finishing up. That was a purl stitch, and then you can work the knit stitch, and then I'm going to skip this stitch and I need to go in purlwise to that first stitch that's on the removable stitch marker. So you just continue working as you normally would using those stitches on the removable stitch marker. I've got a purl stitch here as my last stitch. I'm gonna skip this stitch. Then you're gonna come up in between these stitches from the back to the front. And I usually pull this all the way through in this case so I can come through that front stitch a little bit more easily knitwise. That's the only time I kind of separate out. And then now you can remove the stitch marker and weave in your ends going up the side of, one leg of the stitch and pull everything through. And you are done with your tubular bind off.